leadership by the state of Massachusetts.
This meeting is now being recorded.
And also by the Massachusetts and President's Commission for Employment for People with Disabilities. Also, Mr. Jones of the Disability Law Center's 2011 Individual Leadership Award. He's received that. And last, we have Sandra Harrell, who is the project director of the Vera Institute of Justice Accessing Safety Initiative, which is a federally funded project. And during her tenure at Vera, Sandra has worked closely with over 50 communities, helping them build a multidisciplinary collaboration to ensure that children and all survivors of disabilities get the support they need. Sandra's professional life, and I love this, is focused on the complexities that emerge at the intersection of violence and disability, and remains committed to addressing those complexities in her role at the Vera Institute of Justice. So as you can imagine, we have three really wonderful speakers today, and I hope you were able to hear most of that introduction. Back to you, Cordelia.
Okay, and before we go there, and keep letting us know how we sound and if you can hear us, we just have a few introductory comments before you hear from their speakers. I think these images that are on us on your screens right now are pretty typical of the kinds of images of children that we see in the media, and we're all familiar with how limited they are in terms of how inclusive they are about economic diversity, race, culture, abilities, that the bias that can sometimes be in the media. And we also are familiar with the laws around child sexual abuse with children's names. Again, kind of a similar look among these children. We're not seeing the same kind of diversity or inclusiveness here with the children that many of us have in our lives and work with in this, as are more clearly depicted here. So I think that there, in past webinars and in a lot of our work, we hear a lot about the limitations of what is here. And I am now, as we're moving forward, I think we know that it's critical to be inclusive not only in our images in all of our work, but also in our content, in our concepts, to have people not only welcome in our services, but to have much clearer prevention messages. I have one example. I'm on a board of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, and one of the things that came up there when they're searching for children that are missing is that they realized that they had to work with people with expertise with autism. When children with autism went missing, they were not on any higher alert at first than others. But when they partnered with parents and they partnered with experts in this area, they learned key ways that could help searchers to find, first of all, that it was important to have that information, to have specifics so that children would be responsive to some of the search techniques that weren't working with them, to help that be more effective. It was a critical change in training that's underway and in protocol for searching for children to simply have more of that information. We know that there are many different kinds of abilities and disabilities and in the developmental and intellectual, a wide range. We know that there's not one size fits all, and that approach is not helpful to our children and to our families or to our services. I'm sure some of you have also heard of the book Far From the Tree, Andrew Solomon, that deals with the whole struggle of identity and dealing with what it's like when our children are very different for whatever different reasons than their parents, and what that means as we struggle with identity to find the right kind of services, the right kind of strength, and the ripple of effects in our families in order to help each other as much as possible, and trying to navigate through the political and community values and context, the different personal stories, the medical realities of this, the changing issues around language, the changing issues about approaches as we advance in all of these different fronts, that all of our experts and many of you on the line are working daily to try to sort through and navigate. Back to you, Joan.
Great. And just want to say that even since announcing this, we've been able to both uncover and also have been, so people have contacted us about some really the amazing amount of resources that are out there. And these are just two, I think, sort of particularly great resources that were sent to us while we were just announcing this. And one was the Disability and Abuse Project, which is the first report of the 2012 national survey on abuse of people with disabilities, and also Stop It Now has a series of tip sheets, and this is one in particular for parents of children with disabilities on child sexual abuse prevention. So I'd like to say that, if you can, if you have other resources, to please, take a moment to put them in the chat, and we can also, collect them. That way, you can see them and share them with each other, and we can also send them out at a later time. Let's take a moment to also just say this is came from childwelfare.org. It's a 2009 report, and if you look at this, you can see they looked at children with disabilities and children without disabilities.
Hi,
and,
Joan.
Yeah?
This is Leona. I'm losing you a bit. Can I just do another sound check really quickly? I'm sorry to interrupt.
Sure. Yeah. How can I?
I think it was the signal was fading, so I just wanted to stop it because I know that it was getting jumpy, and see if maybe it's better now.
Okay. Is this better? Can you tell now?
Okay. I think you're fine now. Okay. Thank you.
No, thank you for jumping in, Leon. I appreciate that. So in this report, that it also talks about reported cases, and I think it really shows in the way that just as with other child sexual abuse issues, that these are reported cases. So that what it means is that not all states submit data on disabilities. It also means that many states do not record whether the child has a disability or not necessarily. That's not a regular way of collecting data. And they may have lower rates in some situations, but also they're much more likely, and a number of studies have shown, and our speakers will speak about how they're much more likely to be seriously harmed. So the Vera Institute in particular will be talking a little bit more about some of these national statistics. And last, I want to say that if you look at, again, we're talking a lot about the risk and protective factors, both individual and societal. But I thought it was important to note that one of the key risk factors is the lack of training and understanding, because that affects the ability of social workers and teachers to identify and report suspected maltreatment. And so one action that we can all take is to educate ourselves and educate others about some of the key issues that really affect children with disabilities. And what I love is about, if you agree with that one action you can take is do that education, and that's what you're doing today by joining our webinars. So I think without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Sandra Harrell, who's, again, the project director of the Vera Institute of Justice. And welcome, Sandra.
Thank you so much, Joan. Leona, I'm just doing a sound check. Does my sound okay to you?
It does. Thank you.
Fantastic. Wonderful. So thank you so much to Prevent Connect and CalCASA for inviting me to participate on this webinar today alongside Meg and Keith. This is obviously an incredibly important issue to the Ms. Foundation as well as the Vera Institute of Justice and everyone who has come together to begin to work on this important issue. And so we're thrilled to have this platform to begin to talk about it with practitioners in the field. I just wanted to spend a little bit of time introducing those of you who are on the line who are not familiar with Vera, with our background and our work and sort of how we came to this topic area. The Vera Institute of Justice was founded in 1964. I like to tell people that we were founded when our founder went to the city of New York and said, it doesn't seem particularly fair that people with means who are arrested for petty crimes are able to get out because they're able to post their bail, but people who are poorer have to sit in jail, they lose their jobs, and it's just a cascading ripple effect on their lives once they've been arrested for a relatively petty crime. And he piloted with the city of New York what has become our nationwide bail bond system in the country. And so that's sort of an anecdote to share with you, just a little bit about the history of the Vera Institute of Justice, in that we really work with government organizations and with nonprofit organizations to just build the capacity of both community-based systems and criminal justice systems to ensure that the systems that people turn to for support and for justice are reliable and as socially just as possible. And so that's our background, the Vera Institute's background. But we have been working in partnership with the Office on Violence Against Women in particular since 2005. I know it says on the slide since 2006, but since 2005 onward, Vera Institute has been in partnership with the Office on Violence Against Women to address the issue of violence in the lives of adults with disabilities. Specifically, we have been providing technical assistance to all the Disability Grant Program for the Office on Violence Against Women and to all Office on Violence Against Women grantees on the issue of violence against women with disabilities, violence against people with disabilities. In 2012, we had the opportunity to be able to partner with the Ms. Foundation to bring what we have learned in our work with adults with disabilities to children with disabilities. Oops, went a little too fast. So the goals of a partnership with the Ms. Foundation was really just to get to understand the scope of the problem of of sexual abuse of children with disabilities, and additionally, they wanted to really be able to understand the unique dynamics surrounding sexual abuse of children with disabilities, the unique needs surrounding children with disabilities who experience sexual abuse, and the different resources that impact children with disabilities' experience of sexual abuse and an experience attempting to get support and intervention around the issue of sexual abuse. And then finally, the goal was for us to help the Ms. Foundation to ensure proactively that its movement to end sexual abuse of children was inclusive of children with disabilities and really grounded in the unique dynamics and realities of children with disabilities. Just a little bit of a background there. We released a more thorough sort of snapshot of what we found, but I wanted to share with you just a little bit more about that. Our process was to conduct, it was like a three-phased process. We conducted a literature review internally, so Vera really combines research with practice, so we have an entire research team as part of our institute, and our researchers conducted a very thorough literature review. What we found, of course, is that there's very limited research on the issue of sexual abuse of children with disabilities, and I'll talk more about why that is in just a little bit. But the research that we did find, bears out what Joan was sharing earlier. If we did a meta-analysis of all of the research, and what we found is that children with disabilities are 3 times more likely to be sexually abused than children without disabilities. And children with intellectual or cognitive disabilities are 5 times more likely to be sexually abused than children without disabilities. And yet children with disabilities are least likely to be able to seek safety and support. And I just have a handful of stories that I wanted to share with you that I think illustrate what the experiences are of children with disabilities. And so I just want to encourage you at this point, some of the details here can be triggering, so if you need to, I encourage you to go ahead and step away, put me on mute. The rest of my presentation will be fine without these, but I do think it brings home the point that in real life this is what people with disabilities are experiencing. So in California, there's a story about a young woman named Jennifer who repeatedly was making claims of allegations of being sexually abused in the group home in which she lived. It was actually more of an institution than a group home. And repeatedly, her allegations were ignored. Her cries for help were ignored. Her family's cries for help were ignored. And the opportunity to actually do anything about it was lost, even though they were met with very clear evidence that, in fact, what she was saying was true when she turned up pregnant. And so there was never an investigation. People completely ignored her. Her cries for help were totally ignored, and the perpetrator, the person who committed these acts, was long gone by the time her pregnancy was revealed, and the credibility of what she had been saying all along was revealed. So that's just a very common experience for children with disabilities, is that if they ask for help, there's not an investigation. If they even do very preliminary investigation, they don't do all of the necessary things like collect evidence through a sexual assault forensic examination. It very, very rarely reaches a point of prosecution. And so when you look at those numbers that Joan shared earlier, they don't reflect the reality of what's going on, because if people ever report, those reports very rarely make it outside of whatever insular institution that they've been reported to. And another story that I wanted to share with you is a young woman who experienced a sexual assault in her home, and when she reached out to the emergency room, she called the emergency room for assistance. She was trying to describe what happened to her, but because and this is with her own words, she said she had no concept of how to describe what had happened to her. No one had ever given her the vocabulary or the language or just even the conceptual framework to be able to describe what happened. So the response on the other end was, next time use a condom. And that was the extent of the support she got in the immediate moments after she was raped. She did not know which resources to reach out to, only thought she had was called a hospital, something bad had happened to her. And because of this significant restriction of education to children with disabilities around healthy sexuality and unhealthy sexual violence, and just the entire gamut around not even giving them names for their body parts, Kathy was not able to get the help that she needed in that moment. And for many, many years later, she is still struggling with this. And this also goes to the third story that I wanted to share, which is a young man who experienced sexual violence as when he was in middle school, and he is now in his probably late 30s, and often will share the same story and have the exact visceral and emotional response in sharing that story. And I think one of the takeaways that I wanted y'all to have from that is that even though it has been over 20 years for him having experienced this, and he's experienced some emotional support, there's a profound lack of tailored therapeutic approaches in working with children with disabilities. And because of that, very few people with disabilities actually have the opportunity to heal from what has happened to them, because we haven't tailored our approaches to ensure that our therapeutic interventions will successfully help them heal from trauma. So those are just a handful of the very real experiences that we have when we are exploring this particular work in this field. I just thought that I could anchor some of the rest of my presentation in those real life experiences. I wanted to talk a little bit more about the known risk factors for sexual violence of children with disabilities, because these risk factors are actually built into the very systems that are intended to be supports for children with disabilities. And so children with disabilities, from really almost as soon as they are born, they have a much greater level of isolation, both physical and social isolation. Oftentimes, historically, children with disabilities were immediately institutionalized. That is on the down. It's going down because of an entire movement by people with disabilities to close the institutions, but nonetheless, we're still seeing them isolated in special education programming in their schools, wherein they are not offering prevention education, sex education, or anything along the lines. And they're often socially isolated, so that they're in many ways both on purpose, not inviting people with disabilities to be part of the extracurricular activities or the community-based activities, or even when they are inviting them, not making those activities accessible, and therefore the invitation is moot because the person can't join. There's an incredible lack of control over the life and bodies of children with disabilities. This is true, of course, of children in general, but and most of these risk factors are true for children in general, but they are exacerbated in children with disabilities in the sense that there's an expectation that personal care attendants will have, that they will have full access to this person's body. We had an example was shared from our advisory board of a young woman who had a caseworker over at her house, and the young girl was 12 years old. She was a child with a disability, and in front of the caseworker, the mom changed her diaper. There was no expectation of privacy. There was no expectation that she would that other people did not need to see her nearly grown body, and that is just a general sort of culture that surrounds children with disabilities. It's just a profound lack of control over their life and bodies. Moreover, there are more adults with whom they are in contact. Not only are there educators in the way that children without disabilities encounter, and medical personnel, but children with disabilities also encounter transportation providers, personal care attendants, rehab specialists, physical therapists, just a huge number of adults who could possibly perpetrate, and so that just puts them at a greater risk because they are exposed to more people who might perpetrate. And then obviously there are real limitations to communication, as I shared with Kathy's story, not simply that people with disabilities inherently cannot communicate, but that we as a society have denied them the vocabulary, the lexicon with which to communicate in a really warped attempt to protect them. We have in fact made them prisoners of not having enough information, not being able to get to tell people what is happening to them. But then those who do have communication disabilities, they are often, there's very little accessibility around helping them to better communicate. Children who are nonverbal will often use a communication board to communicate, but the system, the symbol display that is put on that communication board recently was doing a search for those that actually referenced body parts or sexual or domestic violence, and I couldn't find a single one on the web. I'm sure they exist, but if they exist, they're certainly not prevalent. They're certainly not a regular part of these children's lives, and so we're even restricting that ability to communicate for children who are nonverbal simply by very literally keeping the words from them. And then I mentioned already that there's limit to no access to information on sex. I mean, sex education is just not offered in the special education programming and public school systems, and parents are uncomfortable talking with their children, children in general about sex, but specifically children with disabilities who these parents have a hard time imagining as being sexual. They don't broach the subject. Nobody broaches the subject with them, and so there's there's no sense of what healthy sexuality is or what consent is. And as one of our advisors said, if you can't say no, if you just don't even have the knowledge around the basic healthy sexuality, you're really not going to be able to tell the difference when somebody begins to groom you for sexual abuse, et cetera. So it's a significant issue that puts them at great risk. And then overarching all of this is this cultural phenomenon that just depersonalizes children with disabilities, dehumanizes them in many ways, and that I think can be demonstrated in what we see about how children with disabilities are just treated as either subhuman, that you hear story after story about genetic counselors counseling mothers who are going to give birth to a child with Down syndrome to abort the pregnancy, to terminate the pregnancy, where we hear story after story about surgeries for cochlear implants to cure deafness. This whole idea that this diversity of ability that we're seeing in children with disabilities is so deeply wrong that we need to have surgical and medical interventions to cure it is in and of itself saying a great deal about what we say about or what we think about people with disabilities in general, and specifically children with disabilities. So those are some of the known risk factors. I wanted to spend a little bit more time. And Leona, can you give me a sense of my timing at this point?
Hey, Joan.
Hey, Joan.
This is Joan. And it's just if you have about 2 more minutes to wrap up.
Oh yeah, I'm almost there. Great. Okay, so all of that is going on is just sort of these values that we have around children with disabilities. But then our society it really exacerbates the vulnerability that children with disabilities experience because they assume standards of access based on children without disabilities, people without disabilities, and so they create services and therapeutic approaches and sex education for children without disabilities and do not at all consider the realities of children with disabilities in the creation of those. And then obviously denying access to education about healthy sexuality. And then as we saw in Jennifer's story, failing to respond to crimes because they're assuming it's just a misunderstanding, she imagined it, she's making it up, et cetera. Or she's lying for attention, and all of this is undergirded by this sense that that why would that even happen to a person? Like, why would someone even want to do that to a person with a disability? And so crimes are just simply not addressed at all against them. And then when they are addressed, they're often treated as an administrative matter. In other words, an institution or an organization that employs a person who has perpetrated against this child with a disability may be fired, but not reported to the police. And you can imagine the cascading and negative effects that has. And then, of course, I've already mentioned that society, the way that this all builds into what happens in the lives of children with disabilities is that our therapeutic protocols are based on children without disabilities. And yet, the children with disabilities are at a much higher risk of experiencing sexual abuse, yet we have we don't have a whole lot of tailored protocols for intervening and helping them to heal from what they've experienced. And then, importantly, the way that we respond to disclosures of sexual abuse when a response does happen is not by holding accountable the person who committed that sexual abuse, but by restricting the personal freedoms and independence of the victim. And so this is, when you have a group of people who have an entire history of being institutionalized, shut away, hidden away, completely kept away from the rest of society, the threat of being reinstitutionalized is a greater threat than never healing from the trauma of sexual abuse. And so they don't tell. It doesn't come out. So that just sort of brings me to our prevention agenda around this particular piece. So much like I'm sure the prevention agenda you all have around all of this, which is just ensuring that public and organizational policies address sexual abuse of children with disabilities in an effective, appropriate way, specifically in ways that do not draw upon these paternalistic notions of having to shut people with disabilities away, and certainly that they don't draw upon these ableistic notions that children with disabilities somehow are less deserving of help or support than children without disabilities. And then enhancing organizational capacity to serve children with disabilities is an important piece here. We're never going to know the full extent of this problem until we have the capacity to effectively respond to disclosures. Of course, enhancing accessibility to services and systems is a critical component of our agenda, and then importantly, promoting equality of people with disabilities through the work that we do. And those are all of my remarks for the day. I'll turn it over now to our moderators. Thank you.
Great. So I just want to say thank you, Sandra. That was really wonderful, and I know that you don't have much time to give an overview, but that really I think captured some of the ways that we need to be looking at these issues a little bit differently. I want to turn this now over to Meg and Keith, and at the end of theirs, we're going to have a scenario, but also a chance for everybody to also do question and answers. If you do have any questions, please feel free to send them to us in the chat. We'll try to get to them after Meg and Keith are done. So I'll turn this over to Meg, I guess.
All right. Thank you very much. So Sandra talked a lot about the culture and practices of disability services and special education. And I believe, and those of us at Impactability believe, that addressing and changing those social norms and those cultural practices are a very key part of preventing abuse against both youth and adults with disabilities. So we created the Impactability model, which is a model for disability service organizations and schools that both helps prevent abuse and also encourages effective responses to abuse reports. Because as Sandra shared so eloquently in her presentation, the lack of services, the lack of supports, and the great need for education for folks with disabilities means that it's very difficult and almost impossible for us to do any primary prevention without also addressing and supporting the needs of survivors. So I'm going to talk about just a few of the norms in the way we provide services to people with disabilities that me and others without disabilities would not have typically as part of our lives. A lot of the programs that we work with, a lot of the programs that we that support people with disabilities often have what we like to call, or what we've called, a culture of compliance. I remember the primary focus of the Impactability model is changing the organizational culture of Triangle, which is a disability support and advocacy organization in the Boston area, and then using what we learned from that culture change and that implementation to impact the culture of other schools and organizations that we're also working with. And I remember when we first started this work, a colleague of mine who'd been working with folks with disabilities for close to 30 years at the time said, a lot of people with disabilities are just expected to do whatever a person without a disability says. Whether it be what they eat, whether it be what activity they do during the day, sometimes even at the level of what they wear. And imagine a perpetrator or a person at risk to perpetrate in that type of environment. It just, for lack of a better way of saying it, it makes the task of perpetration a lot easier when people are so profoundly socialized to comply. Another challenge that we see in the schools that we work with are when teens with disabilities do things that teens without disabilities do. The reactions are so different. We had a young man, teen with a disability, who had a crush on a girl who didn't reciprocate and told her about that. and he said that he had a crush on her and he loved her. In response, the school decided that he was a predator and made him eat lunch by himself. Now, I imagine a lunchroom at a high school being a bunch of cubicles if every kid who ever had a crush on someone who didn't reciprocate was isolated from their peers and considered dangerous. So when we started Impactability, when we started implementing a lot of the changes that we have implemented within the way we provide services, the first question that we asked ourselves with everything we do, and we all challenge ourselves on a daily basis, is, would I talk to a person without a disability this way? Would I share details about how someone goes to the bathroom in a hallway in an organizational space? Would I speak to somebody in a very high tone of voice? Would I speak to someone the way I would talk to someone who was much younger than the person sitting in front of me? So I'm going to turn it over to Keith now, and he's going to really talk about how we challenge those norms and challenge ableism.
Thank you, Meg. Can everybody hear me? Do I sound okay?
Yeah.
Keith, can everyone just a sound check, because he sounds a little distant to me, but I don't know if he sounds good to everyone else. If you could just say something again for me.
Okay. Can everybody hear me? Does that sound better?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, and thank you, Megan. Again, thanks on this foundation, CASA Connect and Prevent Connect, from having us, and the Verve Foundation for the lead-in was awesome. The challenging the norms and changing services that we do is to address what people who don't really deal with disability on a day-to-day basis would not have an understanding of the term. The term is called ableism. You have sexism, you have racism, you have homophobia. We in the disability community have what's called ableism. This is where services are strictly done from a tab, or the acronym is temporarily able-bodied, for those without disabilities. And we are presented as if we do not exist, as we not having a voice. And so challenging those norms is shifting the dynamic to actually say to organizations, if you are going to do services towards children, are you talking about all children? Are you saying that we are only going to discuss norms for children who are not disabled? And one of the ways in ensuring that and bringing that culture into organizations is asking, are there persons with disabilities in your programmatic design, in your staff meetings, on your staff, or even within your constituency that could bring that to your organization? So one of these things is to make sure that there are visible and coordinated efforts, so that when you invest in trying to design your policies, that you are inclusive of persons with disabilities, that have the ability to say, this is how you should talk about presentation. So clear official policies that talk about prevention, as well as having a whistleblower protection, abuse protection. If you have these things, is there a disability slant to it? So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Meg to talk about our valuable coordinated effort to be continued.
Sure. So a lot of the challenges and inequities that Sandra described so eloquently in the first part of this webinar are the issues that we are trying to address and implement within disability service. So day-to-day, on the ground, what are the decisions that we make on a daily basis that ensures that we are not perpetuating the risk factors that face people with disabilities when it comes to abuse? So there are three main components of the impactability model. The first is having official policies that encourage staff and providers to respond effectively to abuse, to not be silenced by fear of reporting coworkers if they notice or observe risky behaviors. A lot of what we realized when we first started this work is a lot of service providers were scared to do anything, felt like nobody else was doing it, so they didn't want to be the first one to speak up about something like, a staff member saying, I'm going to break your face if you don't get back to work, or I'm going to break your face if you do this, and passing that threat off as a joke. So official policies from the top, we have created model policies for both how to respond to abuse reports and whistleblower policies and other policies that encourage primary prevention. But we know that anything on paper is only worth part of the issue, because we all, know some of the policies of our employers and not others. We all know what people take seriously and what people don't. So another big part of impactability is through training, through support, through identifying and connecting with peer leaders within the disability service provision system to really change the culture of the organization. We do specific education and training for anybody who does personal and intimate care around privacy, respecting someone's body, respecting someone's boundaries. We do sexuality education with adults and youth with disabilities, but just as importantly, we do work for disability service providers to address their challenges with the folks they support being sexual beings. We have some people who, at the beginning of this intervention, would not let anybody who lived in the group home they managed go to their bedroom with their dating partner because they were afraid the person would be abused. So we're addressing some very real concerns that people have, as well as some very deep ableist or ableist-inspired beliefs that people have. The other really key part of the impactability model is giving people with disabilities the tools to protect and advocate for themselves and giving them education about sexuality. Many of the folks in this program are youth, some are adults, some are in their 50s and 60s and got sexuality education for the first time a couple years ago. We believe that self-protection and self-advocacy skills are a very important part of this intervention, because a person with a disability will likely be alone or isolated when someone is attempting to perpetrate, so that person needs to have tools for what to do in that moment. The other important part of that piece of the program is that too many interventions that involve people with disabilities are carried out around them without including them. So we didn't want to be another group of people without disabilities who came in and the entire prevention intervention was focused on staff. So people with disabilities are part of their own safety and part of the safety of other folks with disabilities. Keith, do you want to just talk briefly about our challenges and successes? I'm just a little aware of our time, so I'll pass it back over to you.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Just to be sure that some of our challenges is what has been articulated, I think has been a recurring theme, is basically the appreciation that children or youth with disabilities or individuals with disabilities are just that, individuals. So the challenge is getting people to understand that the population that they are serving actually includes children with disabilities, whether they're aware or not. And so that has been some of our challenges. But some of our successes have been in raising the awareness around individuals with disabilities and abuse. In getting our grant, we were part of the vulnerable population, and once the grant was submitted, they said, oh, people with disabilities are vulnerable. Shocker. And that goes to the heart of one of our challenges as well as some of our successes. The other successes are being able to give individuals with disabilities on our steering committee, as well as through impactability, the ability to experience leadership that actually for the first time have their voices heard, as well as reinforce any of the advocacy pieces that they've learned within impactability and within the stuff that we're doing, within the self-awareness and self-advocacy training that we're having. And our challenges, again, are the way institutions have perceived persons with disabilities, as how they talk about people with disabilities, as well as institutional bureaucracy, and particularly in school systems where in order to bring tools such as impeccability and awareness, simply using the bully campaign is somewhat of a challenge because they are talking about invading individuals' little fiefdoms. So that has been one of our major challenges, is to crack institutions where they believe that children are not basically human, particularly for individuals with disabilities. And lastly, the other challenge is, again, as has been stated before, just the acknowledgement that if you are human, that you do have the right to have a fully healthy sexual identity. And for persons with disabilities, that seems to be one of the hardest things for people to grasp. So at this point, I'll turn it back over to Meg.
Okay, so a lot, I know that probably from the poll that Joan and Cordelia did at the beginning of this call, approximately half of the people on this call are in the child sexual abuse or sexual violence prevention world. And there's been a lot of focus probably in about the last 10 years on mobilizing bystanders and engaging bystanders, people who are not perpetrating, people who are not targeted by perpetrators. So a big piece of the organizational culture change we are implementing within disability services is around challenging conversations and bystander mobilizations. What we find is a lot of risky situations or sort of what we like to call, unchecked emotional abuse can be seen as business as usual. I remember we did a class for a group of young people who attend a school for students with significant medical disabilities, and we did a lesson for the students on assertive communication and setting boundaries with their bodies. And one of the staff came back to us and said, you really have to make sure you're getting your message across because the staff are, being assertive with their PCAs and they're setting boundaries, and that's not what you're talking about, is it? What you're talking about is strangers, right? And that was the moment that I knew the program was working, because people were advocating for themselves and advocating for their bodies. And at the same time, we as people without disabilities who are working in disability service organizations really have a key role to play of, seeing things that our coworkers are doing and, having a culture where people expect and are receptive to looking at, what message am I sending when I give this person a hug? What message am I sending when I'm making my own life easier by serving everyone the same breakfast and not supporting people's choice about what they want to eat? But a lot of those types of conversations, a lot of those moments where people really have an opportunity to grow and become part of protective factors as opposed to risk factors can be very stressful. So a lot of what I take from the years I've spent teaching self-defense is it's really given me, and it's really given a lot of the folks that I teach, an opportunity to manage our physiological adrenaline and stress responses so that when we are faced with a situation in which a challenging conversation could be part of prevention, we can do it. We're not so overwhelmed by our stress response. We're able to have tools to manage that. And because of that, we can create an environment in which there are expectations of privacy, healthy sexuality, body integrity, so that people with disabilities are getting a message that can really help them discern abuse from just business as usual. And I know we're very close to the end of our time, so I will just do this slide very quickly and then turn it over to Keith for the scenario for discussion. When we talk about prevention, we don't just want to talk about disability services, because youth with disabilities should be able to go to any Boys and Girls Club, any youth-serving agency, any other program that is available to support any child or youth. So when those programs are focusing on child sexual abuse prevention, we want to ensure that their understanding of young people and what keeps them safe is inclusive of people with disabilities. So in that spirit, we are going to present a scenario for discussion that Keith will kind of kick off the discussion, and then through the moderators we'll open it up for a broader conversation.
All righty, thank you. As you can see, I'll read the scenario, And what I want you to think about is how would your agency respond prior to this call? The scenario, you're the program director at a youth development organization that has a policy prohibiting any adult from being alone with one child. Your experience with a few questionable volunteers has confirmed your belief that this policy effectively weeds out people who might be perpetrators or perpetrate. Recently, a young woman with a disability began attending your program. She requires assistance when using the bathroom and is used to getting personal care assistance from paraprofessionals at school and staff at her other after-school programs. She values her privacy and does not want more than one person in the bathroom when she is receiving personal care. However, in order to comply with your organization's policy, 2 staff members provide bathroom assistance for her together. She feels uncomfortable, like the second staff member is watching her. Also, other youth get frustrated because losing 2 staff members affects the activities and programs they enjoy. You've heard young people make negative comments about the girl in the wheelchair getting too much attention, and you worry that that is affecting her ability to make friends. So with that scenario, think about how you would address that and what are some of the challenges and some of the possible solutions.
Right, and also just sort of going way back in time, how might that policy have been different if young people with disabilities who require personal, intimate care had been considered as part of the population that the youth serving organization serves?
So this is Joan, and what we'd like to do is ask people in the audience to, if you have some thoughts about that, as our speakers are sort of answering that question, if you could type those into the chat. Again, the question is, how might the policy be different if it had been developed, with children and teens with disabilities in mind? And I think they talked about maybe the Chief that you would do the first to respond here.
Yes. Well, I guess in some of the organizations that I work for and work with, some of the challenges are that when you talk about these kind of scenarios, people who are the policymakers often go, oh, we've never thought of it in that way. And part of it is you don't know what you don't know, but the other half is you should be aware that when you are serving youth, that youth come in much like different ethnicities, different genders, different sexual identities. They also come with differing abilities. And one of those things is how to be more inclusive in order to serve all of the participants. And also to undermine the scenario, just like we said, where some of the kids were talking about that girl in the wheelchair. That again goes to the very isolation that oftentimes youth with disabilities perceive. So I think some of the organizations that have been successful have taken a universal approach and understanding that it is not one size fits all, that each child comes with its own unique challenges and successes and goods and bads, and that they need to have a policy that is broad enough but flexible enough to address that.
Great, thank you, Keith. And I wonder, Sandra, if you want to add something as well, and then when we go through some of the audience responses after that.
Okay.
Hi, this is Sandra. I think that Keith touched upon a number of the pieces that I would add, which is just if you are proactive in designing your policies to account for people with disabilities in the population that you serve, then this policy might look very different in that it would outline already the possibility that there would be a child with a disability who has a personal care attendant, and that would already be outlined in the policy and accounted for. I'd love to hear what Meg has to say.
Yeah, I mean, I think the issue here is that the young woman feels uncomfortable with a second person in the bathroom. And I understand and truly respect, having done a lot of organizational policy development, that it can be really useful to have a one-size-fits-all, it's absolutely this way at all times, in all circumstances policy, because a lot of situations in which people are at risk to perpetrate often start with sort of ducking around the holes in a policy. However, when it comes to things like intimate care, in which supporting people's privacy and supporting people's choice about their bodies is really a protective factor, I would like to see an organization come up with an exception to the policy and sort of a screening and training of anyone who is providing intimate care, whether that person was a designated personal care attendant or whether that person was a regular employee with multiple responsibilities. Because I think the circumstances in which a young person who doesn't need intimate care would legitimately need to be alone with one adult, there are some, and I know there's therapy sessions and there's other sort of one-on-one interactions, but I think there's a lot less necessity for those types of interactions. But if in designing that type of policy, there are clear, sort of clear, explicit exceptions and perhaps additional training and support for staff who are in those intimate care roles, then I think we can both accomplish the prevention goal of the one child, one adult policies that exist and not have a young person feel like she's on display when she's getting her personal care, and also feel like her choice and her body is being supported.
Great, thank you. These are really wonderful insights. And I think one of the things I want to also comment on is that at least in my experience in working with youth-serving organizations, that at one level I want to actually commend the organization also for not only having a policy but also implementing it. Mm-hmm. Clearly, it needs to have a lot of the features that you, all three of you, so eloquently talked about. But I think that a lot of organizations have not even gotten as far as this one. And what I love about particularly the comments that are coming through is that almost they're addressing some of our second question, which was going to be, is given the current policy, how would you address the current situation? And people are talking about how to move it towards a more trauma-informed policy, and then how do you build empathy within the organization? So people are talking about role plays and also giving a voice to the young woman. So these are just some of the, I think, really great comments that are coming forward. And just in terms of time, I wonder if maybe in the same order of Keith, Sandra and Meg, if you want to say, is there anything else you'd want to add in terms of given the current policy, what would you do to address that current situation? Are there any other specific tools that you would offer to an organization to go back right into the situation?
Do you guys mind if I jump in? Oh, go ahead, Kate.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Maggie.
Okay. I just have an idea that I might forget. So one of the things that we've implemented with Impactability is a training for personal care, residential staff, and others who do personal and intimate care that really focuses on having people really support choice, ask how somebody wants to receive personal care. If this young woman is feeling watched, maybe if the policy cannot change, maybe the two people can both be actively involved in the personal care if that's helpful to her. Or if not, the two people can work with the young woman around what is going to make her feel less uncomfortable with the personal care. Because really what we want to teach through personal and intimate care is people's bodies being their own and people's even, regardless of what level of medical assistance or personal care assistance someone needs, we want people to have choice about their bodies. One of the things, we have a staff member who's on our abuse prevention leadership team who uses a wheelchair and has personal care staff, and one thing that she said that was so powerful is she's always been taught that she has to be nice to everybody because she needs their help. And she's been told by one of her parents to not be too difficult in order to keep the personal care attendant. So a lot of sort of changing and addressing that socialization. Another sort of side benefit of doing this training is that people who provide personal intimate care are doing some of the most difficult jobs I can imagine, and often doing so with no recognition, not a lot of pay, and don't get a lot of support and training. So one thing that was really transformative here is people who are usually invisible within the organization being seen as leaders in abuse prevention. You know, that day that you took some extra time brushing someone's hair in a way that they wanted so that they could feel the integrity of their body and the power of their self-advocacy is as much a part of abuse prevention as any visible poster that I might design. So I think really valuing trauma-informed and prevention-informed intimate care is a huge key.
And this is Sandra, if I may jump in. I just don't want our audience members to walk away with a false notion here. And so I think it's important, piggybacking on what Meg and Keith are saying, to remind everyone that a personal care attendant is someone who that is their job. They've gotten some level of training for that. That's what they've been hired to do. So just because you're a youth-serving organization and you have adults there does not mean that those adults are the right people to provide personal care. The personal care attendant should be the person who the person with the disability needing that personal care has chosen and is employed by that person, not just a random adult helping someone go to the bathroom.
Right. And I guess I would add that one of the things, and again, going back to the use of trauma-informed policy creation, is also making sure that the cultural component is there. A lot of times we want to try to reduce people down to either their cognitive, sensory, or fine motor challenges, but understanding that much like their gender identity or their sexual identity, their disability identity, even for children, which I think a lot of people have trouble framing, is just as important as their cultural identity, because what we may see as effective abuse prevention policy may come in conflict with some of the cultural norms that may trump whatever policy, even in prevention, that we're trying to prevent or address. So making sure not only are the people who help you design your policy reflective of the constituency you're trying to serve, but also understand that the way I may think of abuse, even though it's in the policy or not in the policy, may come in conflict with what you may deem as being policy. So, again, I guess one of the things that I would add for you all is when you look at your policy, is it culturally relevant? Is it class relevant? Is it disability relevant? Is it taking into account that all the children are not just defined by their youth, but they're made of a multiplicity of factors?
Keith, thank you for that. And you're in some ways transitioning into this next question of what values guide your decision about organizational abuse prevention protocols. Did you want to add to that, or did we want to go back to Meg or Sandra?
All right. No, I think we can go back to Meg or Sandra.
How about Sandra?
I'm punting that one over to Meg.
Okay. Okay, I guess I have no further people to pass it to, so I have to say something. I've actually just been reading some of the chat comments, and it's a really, really very good conversation going on there. A lot of people, somebody particularly mentioned Dave Hinsberger, who has written a book called The Ethics of Touch, as well as several other books. His work has really been a very strong foundation of what we do. For those who haven't heard of David Hinsberger, he's a disability advocate based in Canada, who does a lot of work both around prevention and around ableism and social justice within disability services, as well as also sexuality. So I think to Sandra's point, personal and intimate care should be the work of somebody who is trained to do that and who has the skill set to do that. Some folks that we support have personal care attendants with them all the time. Other folks that we support don't need intimate care all the time, but may have a situation where a staff member who has multiple responsibilities is also providing them personal care. Some of the schools we work with have paraprofessionals whose job is personal care, but also have other responsibilities and other relationships with youth. So I think one thing in looking at a policy like this is being very clear about whose job is intimate care and whose job is not, because that can be a really key piece of prevention, that everybody is in their role and within their expertise and their knowledge when interacting with a person with a disability, particularly around something related to their bodies. I think in terms of values, clearly this organization values primary prevention and values the safety of children, so much so that they are taking a huge step back and really removing any opportunity for anyone to perpetrate an act of abuse. At the same time, this organization, this hypothetical organization, is doing so in a way that has a very one-size-fits-all. There is never any opportunity where it is a protective factor for an adult to be alone with a child. And I think other services and other situations in which young people may find themselves do have very legitimate and helpful and positive reasons for young people and adults to be in one-on-one situations. So I would maybe look at the value of safety and look at the value of empowering young people and creating protective factors and get a little more nuanced about what that looks like and how maybe personal care attendants have different standards than staff who don't provide personal care, because that can really maintain the value of prevention while introducing the value of inclusion.
And there's a point.
Go ahead, Cordelia.
I was just going to say there's another point, too, that really works with Diego is saying just about policy work in general, that having had found an effective policy, of course, part of the process then is still evaluating it, fine-tuning it, seeing how it works, seeing if what you hope for the outcomes are really what the outcomes are that are happening. And that kind of foundation of respect as a value. So that, as was noted and is often true on these, the chat discussions are rich. There's a lot of resources being mentioned, a lot of excellent points being made. So that those are, just to reiterate that, the recording of this, the handouts, and this chat will also be available after this call. But if there's nothing else to say about the scenarios, or actually it probably would be a lot, we want to pick up on a few of the other questions that have come up so far and points that have come up with the speakers. And as you've been doing quite naturally, if Joan or I ask one of you to answer and you just as soon punt it off to someone else, that is absolutely fully encouraged back and forth here. There have been some questions specific to different people, and we'll see how many of these we get to. But there was a couple of people asking about whether or not you really feel might be in something that you've said already or something that you've seen or another scenario that would be examples of really positive sexual educational messages, sexual or otherwise. And should we go back to Sandra for that?
Sure. Sure. I think that Roberta Sick and Julie Petty have done some fantastic work in Arkansas around developing a primary prevention approach to prevention of abuse of people with disabilities that really talks about combating the culture of compliance, really combating this prison of protection that we've created around children with disabilities by educating children with disabilities about healthy sexuality, about what healthy relationships look like, about what sex is and how to consent to sex and what their rights are. Really looking at sort of their curriculum really looks at just the right to have risk in your life, the dignity of being able to take risks in your life without that then becoming your fault that something bad has happened to you. So I would take a look at Partners for Inclusive Environments, I think it is, Partners for Inclusion in Arkansas. Roberta Sick and Julie Petty have done some fantastic work around this already.
Great, thank you. Does anybody else want to comment on that?
I think. Go ahead, Keith.
Go ahead, Meg. Ladies first.
I think a really important piece of sexuality education is actually for parents, teachers, and providers. We've done just as much actual sexuality education with folks with disabilities as we have with the people in their lives who might otherwise be uncomfortable with them being sexual beings. And we've had to really address a lot of very, very deep fears around people not being, around people with disabilities not having any circumstance in which it is safe or positive for them to have sex. And that has been a huge shift for a lot of people. And, I think the right to take risks, as Sandra said, is part of, what we're working against. Part of ableism is, keeping adults with disabilities or teens with disabilities in roles that we would typically associate with children without disabilities. So really not just providing knowledge about sex and consent and people's bodies and what they like, what they enjoy, what they don't. We've done plenty of that. But also working with people whose discomfort comes from a really good place and comes from really caring and loving, in some cases, the folks that they're supporting, but may really keep them in a role of a non-sexual being when they are an adult.
Right, and to be clear, that one of the things that we have to understand is that in this prevention work, people always talk about how tragic it is about somebody using children for ill-gotten gains around sexual behavior and sexual assault. But then once you add a disability, much like we do in our larger society, it's instantly dismissed. And one of the challenges that we have, and I like to remind people that even though we do the work, we don't leave ourselves at home. So whatever biases and prejudices that we carry within ourselves, that also carries into the way we do the work. And one of the challenges and some of the best practices are realizing that you don't know what you don't know. If you are serving a very diverse community, is doing those things and good policy practices. One of the changes on the larger scene around sexual identity was the issue where the Boy Scouts opened it up because of the pushback from not allowing children who identified different through their gender and their sexuality. We need to get to that place for youth with disabilities. And to Meg's point around parents, teachers, and providers, it is basically simple. Much like in my own personal experience, people have that, but for the grace of God, there go I. Because you cannot conceptualize yourself in a position that the person with the disability may find themselves in. So if you can conceptualize about it, it's very easy for it to fall off the radar. So I think some of the best practices have been when people have said, okay, when they do own self-assessment, self-evaluation, if you think you're doing a perfect job, then you are not. If you know that you can constantly learn, those are some of the best practices that I've seen.
Thank you. And Joan, I got to check in with you because we're near the end of our time. Do you think we have time for the one action and takeaway? And which one do you want to do?
I think we can just. I think it's time for just one. So why don't we just go for it? Since I know the Miss Foundation really loves to move towards action, so why don't we just do one quick action? And what we're looking for is just one action. And Claudia, if you could forward the slides, because I got kicked out of the session somehow. So what is one action you can suggest for others who want to take action around child sexual abuse and disabilities? So if you can just do like a quick, I know this is hard, but just what's your one action and say it in 1 minute? And I'm going to throw Meg to you first.
Oh, gosh. One action.
Meg, to buy you a little time.
Thank you.
For all the listeners, while Meg is, since we called on her first to give her a little time here, while she's articulating this, if you think about, you've listened to this, what's one action, one takeaway? Maybe it's a resource that came up. Maybe it was an idea. What's an action that you really want to take, that you feel like is most important out of all these things you've heard, or a place to start?
I think one action that I've taken a lot, which is really sort of foundational to abuse prevention, is when I interact with my colleague who is one of my co-trainers who has a disability, I often ask myself, am I treating him differently than my coworkers without disabilities? And if so, why? And if so, how can I change that?
That's fabulous, and just really easy to actually implement as we lead the session. Keith, do you want to go next on that?
Okay. One action is to open it up to the community, invite the community in, and as opposed to speaking to the community, ask the community, what do they think is missing? Where are the gaps? That's one action that we've often taken when people are trying to explore or to broaden their scope of services to people that they may traditionally skipped over for inadvertent reasons. So, again, open it up, bring the community in, invite the community as well as individuals with disabilities to participate in program design, policy design, and involved in the community organization so that you can get support. So that would be the action that I would suggest.
That's great. Thank you, Keith. And one more, Sandra, from you. 1 minute, one action.
1 minute, one action. Okay, so there's a number of actions that are roaming around in my head, but I'm going to piggyback on what Keith just said and encourage folks to bring people with disabilities into their programming so that you're actually building leadership among people with disabilities to address these issues within their community so that it is not, so that your sexual violence programming actually includes people with disabilities. And the way to do that, obviously, one of the very important first steps is to ensure accessibility of your programming to people with disabilities.
Great. Thank you so much. And our next one, Joan, I'll pull back to you because we've got to go. There's a lot of people asking for more attention to some of the information that's in the chats, but Joan, do you want to just mention the speaker contact here?
Sure, thank you. So, again, everybody can access all these slides. So this information is available online through Prevent Connect. But here's the speaker contact information for Meg, for Keith, and for Sandra. And each of them have wonderful websites and programs that are definitely worth your time looking into.
And just very quickly here, since we're at the end of our time, our final Ending Child Sexual Abuse web conference series of this series is coming up March 13th, Telling Our Stories and Learning as We Build a Movement. And you have certainly given us a lot of information, a lot of heart, and a lot of examples of how to do that.
And I just want to have a huge thank you to each of our three presenters. It was just a wealth of information, and I think on a topic that people don't often have a chance to talk about. And I also I want to thank everybody in the audience. The chat really was amazing, and I think I personally want to actually take the time to read through those. All that will be posted on the website, so you can read back through it as well. And a big thank you to the MIS Foundation for investing in this, and for Prevent Connect for making the technology of this happen. And so thank you, everyone, for making this such an amazing webinar today.
We'll just ask all the participants to click off, and you will be getting an evaluation. And again, thank you to our speakers. Did a wonderful job, and participants were very active. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Bye-bye.